Back. I'm Miss Newroth, and I'm here today to talk with you about consequences of population distribution. What are you going to learn today? Well, first of all, geographers are interested in exploring the dynamic between population and the Earth's resources. In the last video, you learned that where people are located has political, social, and economic consequences. But where people located also has environmental consequences. We talked in the last video about how there are 4 major population clusters in the world today, 3 of the major clusters being in Asia. But as you've noticed, and as I pointed out before, there are major population clusters in other parts of the world as well. If you look at South America, you may notice that most people are concentrated along the coastlines. In the United States, we have a major population concentrated on the east coast of our country. And in Egypt, it's always very interesting to see how people are clustered very closely along the Nile River. You can even see that here in the map of the world. You can see that concentration of people right along the river. Today, we're going to be taking a look a little bit deeper at the impact of population concentration on the environment and on resources. There's actually a story behind the photo that you see here. I had the opportunity this summer to go to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for the very first time. And this picture is a little deceiving because what you don't know is that right behind me is a long, long line of cars. I was stuck in a terrible traffic jam for about 2 hours while in this absolutely spectacular place. And what I came to learn is that the Smoky Mountains National Park is one of the most visited national parks in the United States. And part of the reason for that is because there is a major population cluster in the eastern half of the United States. So this is one of the national parks in the United States that is the easiest for a lot of people to visit because it's physically closer to them. So there is a challenge for the people who manage the park to manage the massive population that comes to visit this park every year. So there are environmental consequences of trying to dispose of trash, dealing with pollution from so many cars being there. So this would be just a small example of the consequence of population clusters on the environment. One of the terms that you'll hear is this idea of carrying capacity. So what is this and how does it relate to overpopulation? Well, you can think about it as the relationship between 2 things, the population size and the amount of resources available. In other words, you can think about it this way. Can the land and water support human life? Now, we could look at the carrying capacity of the entire planet, or we could scale down to look at the carrying capacity of a country or even a local area. In the first scenario here, there are more than enough resources for the population. So it would be below carrying capacity, and we would consider this a sustainable lifestyle. The second is where the population is matched there at the resources. There's just enough resources for that population. If the population grows, or if there aren't enough resources, it would spill over into that third category of being over carrying capacity. In this case, it is not a sustainable way to live. There are too many people for the resources available there. Now, carrying capacity is not fixed. Human actions can alter the carrying capacity. So for instance, changes in farming techniques to focusing on more sustainable ways of farming. And not only that, but the differences or changes in the land that people are living on. If you're living in a desert environment that cannot support very much life, then the carrying capacity of a particular place may be very low, a very, very small population. Where if you live in an area with lush forests and many natural resources, that land may be able to sustain a whole lot more human life. And the picture here that you see is taken in Tanzania, where the farmers are practicing a more sustainable form of agriculture, where they are not overusing the resources. It's farming that takes place without a lot of chemicals, so that they are treating the world and their environment in a sustainable way so that their population does not exceed the carrying capacity of their area. Now, there are basically three ways that geographers may measure population density. Now, the first is very simple. I tell my students this is simple arithmetic. It is the total number of people divided by the total land area. Pretty simple and straightforward. Now, we could stop there, but there are other ways to measure population density, especially when we consider how a population may affect the natural environment or the resources of an area. We could look at physiological density. This would be the number of people per unit of arable or farmable land. Now, this goes back to the example I gave in the last slide. If you're in a desert area, then you may have high numbers of people per farmable land because there is very little farmable land. The physiological density would be very high. Whereas if you're in an area with lots and lots of farmable land, then the ratio would be lower. And this is one way geographers can study the impact that people are having on the land around them. A third way to measure would be agricultural density. This is where a geographer would look at the ratio of the number of farmers to arable or farmable land. So do you have lots and lots of farmers trying to farm a very small amount of farmable land? Or do you have an abundance of farmable land and very few people being farmers in your society? How the people use the land, the farmable land, is also an interesting way for geographers to get a more clear picture about how humans are impacting their environment. So you might want to consider, how might these three ways of measuring population density provide geographers with different ways of understanding the relationship between people and the earth? You can pause the video and consider that now. Let's take a moment to practice with this information. I have a question here. The ability of a resource base to sustain a population is known as its, well, we've learned about ratios, we've talked about limits. In the last video, we talked about employment. We've discussed carrying capacity today, and certainly we've discussed the possibilities of population pressure on the environment. Well, if you've been paying attention, you probably know that the ability of a resource base to sustain a population is known as its carrying capacity. Finally, what should you take away from this video today? Where people are located has environmental consequences. Geographers may look at this or may determine the impact of this by looking at things like arithmetic density, physiological density, and agricultural density. And finally, by determining the carrying capacity of various places. As we move forward in the next videos, you'll have an opportunity to explore further how different populations around the world, from less developed countries to developing countries to more developing countries, have an opportunity to interact with their environment in different ways. As I always say, keep your eyes out because geography is everywhere.